Ever since Donald J. Trump first set foot in the Oval Office, he has not hidden his disdain for the Federal Reserve's leadership. In his trademark bombast, he has assailed Chairman Jerome Powell by name-blaming him for keeping interest rates too high, choking off growth and driving Wall Street jitters. Yet in recent weeks, the former president's campaign advisors have floated a proposal that would take this antagonism to an entirely new level. Installing a shadow Fed chairman, a parallel monetary authority operating in secret. This concept, an idea so unprecedented that it has no analog in the Fed's 111-year history, has sent shockwaves through financial markets, rattling investors and policymakers alike. What does it mean to have a Fed president in the dark? In essence, the plan envisions naming in advance a second voice on monetary policy, someone who would shadow Powell, sit in closed meetings, pore over economic forecasts, and then issue judgments of their own. That person would not merely be an advisor behind the scenes, but effectively a co-chair who could, at any moment, contradict or undermine the official Fed line. In campaign rhetoric, the shadow Fed chairman would serve three purposes all at once: to signal Trump's dissatisfaction with rate hike restraint, to telegraph a looser monetary stance for 2025, and to bully the Fed into preemptive rate cuts long before Powell or his board of governors felt it prudent. The scheme was first proposed by Scott Bentsen, a Trump finance advisor and longtime critic of Fed orthodoxy, in a memo circulated last year. Under Benson's blueprint, the White House would name its own Fed president clandestinely, without public disclosure until a predetermined date. Treasury and OMB would then confer with the dark chair, receiving monthly briefings on his or her outlook for growth, inflation, unemployment, and global capital flows. In theory, this parallel structure would turbocharge policy coordination. As soon as the official Fed signaled hawkish intentions, the shadow chairman would stir up market expectations of imminent easing. The diffusion of authority, Benson argued, would end Powell's stranglehold on the policy narrative and reset the Fed's expectations framework in Trump's favor. To economic historians, the proposal verges on the surreal. No other U.S. president has ever dared to intrude so directly into the Fed's inner circle. Back in the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt famously packed the Fed's Board of Governors and reshaped its structure, but he still operated within the confines of public appointments. Likewise, in the 1970s and 1980s, presidents like Nixon and Reagan railed publicly at Fed Chairman Arthur Burns and Paul Volcker. Yet they never attempted to create parallel decision-making bodies. Even in the darkest moments of presidential pressure, the Fed's institutional independence held firm. What Trump now envisions would shatter that wall. A half-century ago, Fed watcher John Kenneth Galbraith warned of the perils when politics collides with monetary policy. Once you invite politics into the temple of central banking, he wrote, you lose both holiness and independence. Today, his words echo ominously in the gilded halls of the Eccles building. Fed historians point to the disastrous politics of the 1936-1937 tightening cycle, when Roosevelt's overt meddling helped prolong the Great Depression. They recall how Fed board seats were traded like political spoils, undermining both credibility and economic stability. The shadow chairman plan would resurrect those ghosts and risk a replay of policy chaos. Veteran Fed insiders stress that the very idea of two competing Fed chairs is antithetical to how the system operates. At present, 8 governors appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, plus the rotating presidents of the 12 regional Fed banks, deliberate together in open sessions of the Federal Open Market Committee. They discuss staffing, models, forecasts, and global risks before voting on a single policy statement. Their deliberations, while confidential during meetings, culminate in an agreed consensus, communicated transparently to the public. A shadow chairman, by contrast, would introduce an entirely separate advisory channel, leaking alternative projections and policy roadmaps into the market, sapping the clarity that is critical to anchoring expectations. Alan Blinder, vice chair under Alan Greenspan in the mid-1990s, summed up the consensus among Fed veterans. It's a terrible idea. Blinder's argument is straightforward. Markets thrive on singular, credible guidance, precisely the clarity the Fed has worked decades to build. Injecting a second, conflicting narrative would fracture that credibility, leading to wildly divergent interest rate forecasts and exchange rate disturbances. If you have a Fed president in the dark, Blinder told Bloomberg, the market will have to interpret two voices at once. That only increases uncertainty, and markets hate uncertainty. What's more, he added, the silent chairman could offer nothing more than conjecture, no legal or operational power to implement policy, no vote on open market operations, no real means to turn projections into actions. It would be nothing more than theater. Yet for Trump's team, theater is the point. By dangling the prospect of a secret Fed partner, they seek to rattle Wall Street enough to force Powell's hand. In campaign speeches, Trump has declared that low rates are job creation magic, promising that under his leadership money will come pouring back. For investors fatigued by a grinding cycle of rate hikes from near zero in early 2022 up to 5.5% by late 2024, the prospect of an immediate pivot to dramatic easing is tantalizing. The mere possibility of a shadow Fed chairman has already pushed markets into overdrive. In the days after the report surfaced, the US dollar index fell 0.3%, hovering near its lowest level since February 2022 as traders recalibrated expectations for Fed policy in 2025. But would Powell and the broader Fed acquiesce? At its core, the Fed's dual mandate requires balancing price stability with maximum employment. With inflation still above the 2% target, despite moderating from 7% in mid-2022 to around 3.5% today, caution remains paramount. The Fed has successfully steered U.S. inflation down without plunging the economy into recession. In fact, unemployment is at 3.8%, near historic lows. In public statements, Powell has emphasized patience, noting that while inflation is falling, the job market remains robust, a combination that warns against complacency. Introducing a shadow chairman would risk overriding that careful calibration, forcing premature cuts that could reignite price pressures. Internationally, too, the ripple effects could be severe. The impulse toward policy transparency that the Fed helped pioneer following the Volcker era's secretive operations has become a template for central banks worldwide. From the European Central Bank to the Bank of England and beyond, the practice of publishing meeting minutes and policy projections has enhanced accountability and predictability. If the U.S. president installs a secret monetary advisor, other nations might follow suit, plunging the international monetary system into a new era of opacity and volatility. Emerging markets, which have endured swings in commodity prices and capital flows since 2020, would be particularly vulnerable. Sudden shifts in U.S. rates trigger waves of portfolio reallocations across Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Imagine those waves amplified by the uncertainty of dual U.S. policy signals. This proposal also raises stark questions about the separation of powers. The Fed was established in 1913 precisely to insulate monetary policy from political pressures. Its 9 governors enjoy staggered 14-year terms to outlast presidential cycles. Its chair serves a 4-year term that overlaps administrations. The founders of the Federal Reserve System believed that an independent central bank would deliver macroeconomic stability better than direct executive control. A shadow Fed chairman, appointed by the president but hidden from public view, would violate that principle. It would undermine not only Fed independence but the constitutional checks and balances designed to prevent any branch of government from wielding unchecked power over the money supply. Legal scholars warn that the shadow chairman would face immediate court challenges. Plaintiffs from shareholders to state attorneys general could argue that the plan circumvents the administrative procedure act by injecting policy advice without the transparency and public comment required for such a role. They could assert that it breaches the Federal Reserve Act by creating an unauthorized policy body. Even if the courts allowed a secret chairman to exist temporarily, the reputational damage to both the Fed and the presidency would be profound. Behind the scenes, Fed governors are steeling themselves for an onslaught. Fed watchers report that several non-voting officials have privately drafted contingency plans. If Trump names a dark chairman, the Fed could respond by releasing additional data on the public record or holding an off-cycle press conference to assert its prevailing stance. The Fed's legal counsel is rumored to be reviewing rapid amendments to Fed bylaws that would explicitly prohibit parallel advisory roles. In short, if Trump fires the first shot, the Fed intends to return fire. Yet the bigger question looms: why is Trump so fixated on interest rate policy? For an ex-president whose own economic record is mixed, stock markets soared under his tenure. But GDP growth slowed in his second year. The Fed remains the ultimate scapegoat. By blaming Powell, he deflects criticism of his administration's tax cuts, trade wars, and pandemic response. By proposing a shadow chairman, he creates a powerful rhetorical device. My shadow Fed man will fix your rates, he can claim, aligning himself with Main Street's frustration and Wall Street's desire for yield-boosting cuts. From a political strategist's standpoint, the shadow chairman gambit is pure theater designed less to become policy than to mobilize the base. In campaign rallies, the idea feeds into Trump's narrative of a rigged system. They won't listen to me, he tells supporters. So I'll put my own man in there and you'll see the difference. It taps into populist resentment of technocratic institutions and offers a simple remedy to complex economic challenges. Even if the plan never materializes, the mere threat can shift market expectations and deliver a short-term boost to Trump's polling among economic skeptics. Still, savvy investors know that the Fed's independence is its most valuable asset. Repeat it. Political meddling could destroy that independence, ultimately making monetary policy less effective. If the Fed succumbs to shadow voices, it risks undermining the credibility that anchors inflation expectations. And once credibility is gone, inflation becomes harder to control, forcing the Fed to resort to harsher measures down the road. As Keynes himself observed, confidence is the currency of capitalism. Once lost, it is fiendishly difficult to restore. Ultimately, whether the shadow chairman sees the light of day or remains a campaign curio, the episode underscores a deeper truth. In an era of polarized politics and growing economic anxiety, the traditional boundaries between government branches are under constant assault. Trump's proposal violates highly guarded norms but also highlights that central banking, no matter how arcane, lies at the heart of modern democracy. When a former president can toy with remaking the Fed's internal mechanics, it signals a breakdown in the unspoken contract that central bankers hold above petty politics. In the coming months, as the 2025 Fed calendar unfolds and markets parse every word from the Eccles building, the shadow chairman's story will serve as a test case. If Powell stands firm and courts uphold the Fed's exclusive authority, the plan will fade into campaign lore. But if whispers of a shadow figure continue to unsettle rate trajectories and currency markets, investors may demand more explicit legal protections for the Fed's independence. Either way, the debate will be fierce, the stakes enormous, and the outcome critical for the future of American economic governance. One thing is certain. The idea of a shadow Fed chairman has already rewritten the rules of engagement between the White House and the central bank. What was once an unthinkable breach of protocol has become a talking point in the most consequential elections since 2020. As America's monetary guardians prepare to defend their citadel, they face not just a battle over interest rates, but a broader struggle over the integrity of the Federal Reserve System itself. In the end, whether the Fed retains its singular voice or is forced to share the stage with a ghostly co-chair will shape the contours of U.S. economic policy for years, perhaps decades to come.